The case of the missing heirloom, Inspector Purbright. BBC radio drama. The Chalmsbury Antiquarian Society convened, as it had for the past 67 years, on the second Tuesday of the month. Its members gathered in the lesser hall of the Chalmsbury Assembly Rooms, a chamber whose air of municipal grandeur was perpetually undermined by the competing odours of floor polish and stale tea urns. The subject of the evening's lecture was Romano-British pottery shards of the Upper Chal Valley, a topic that promised, and indeed delivered, a profound and comprehensive dullness. Inspector Purbright, seated discreetly at the back, was not attending out of a newfound passion for pottery. His presence was a small concession to the chief constable, who believed that an occasional police appearance at such functions fostered a sense of civic partnership. Purbright viewed it more as an exercise in public endurance. He allowed the lecturer's monotone, a dry, crumbling drone that perfectly matched his subject matter, to wash over him, his gaze drifting across the familiar landscape of Chalmsbury society. There was Councillor Hewing, the society's chairman, looking pained and important in equal measure. There was Mr. Pond, the solicitor, whose face was fixed in an expression of intellectual concentration that Purbright knew from experience was a mask for deep slumber. And there, in the front row, holding court from a single, unforgivingly upright chair, was Miss Elspeth Penhaligon. Miss Penhaligon was not merely a resident of Chalmsbury. She was a local institution, as immovable and ornate as the market cross. Her family had not exactly founded the town, but they had, over several centuries, owned a significant portion of it, a fact she never felt the need to mention, but which radiated from her like heat from a cast-iron stove. Tonight, her presence carried an extra charge of significance, for after the lecture, she was to provide the evening's grand finale, a viewing of the Penhaligon brooch. The brooch was an object of near mythical status in the town, a florid knot of worked gold and dubious gemstones alleged to have been gifted to a Penhaligon ancestor by a desperate Stuart king. To the society it was history. To Chalmsbury it was the ultimate symbol of a social hierarchy that creaked but never broke. At last, the lecture on pottery shards subsided into a thin trickle of applause. Councillor Hewing rose, smoothing his waistcoat. "And now," he announced, his voice booming with relief, "for a true treat, a piece of living history. I invite Miss Penhaligon to favour us with a look at her celebrated family heirloom." A murmur of genuine anticipation rustled through the hall. This was the main event. This was what had persuaded them to forego an evening with the wireless. Miss Penhaligon inclined her head, a gesture of regal modesty that managed to convey the immense favour she was bestowing. She carried a small, domed box of dark velvet, worn to a soft patina by the touch of generations. With the deliberate pace of a high priestess approaching an altar, she advanced to the baize-covered table at the front. A reverent hush descended. Even Mr. Pond seemed to have woken up. Miss Penhaligon placed the box on the table. She did not hurry. She allowed the moment to ripen. Her gloved fingers went to the small brass clasp, a fixture as familiar to the town's collective imagination as the town hall clock. She flicked it open. She lifted the lid. The assembled company leaned forward as one. For a second, nothing happened. Miss Penhaligon simply stared into the box. Her expression, usually a fortress of ironclad composure, seemed to falter. The corners of her mouth tightened. A faint, papery quality entered her complexion. The silence in the room stretched from expectant to awkward. Councillor Hewing cleared his throat. "Everything in order, Miss Penhaligon?" She did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the plush, indented lining of the box. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a strained and terrible whisper that carried to every corner of the hall. "It's gone." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a well. There was a collective intake of breath, the sound of 50 people simultaneously remembering the rules of decorum.
A gasp from the front row.
A confused muttering from the back. Councillor Hewing scurried forward. "Gone, my dear lady, what do you mean?" "It can't be." He peered into the box as if the brooch might simply be hiding. But the indentation, shaped by a century of containing its treasure, was starkly, scandalously empty. "It has been stolen," Miss Penhaligon declared, her voice regaining its formidable timbre. The whisper was gone, replaced by the clang of steel. It was an accusation directed at the room, at the town, at the world itself. From his seat at the back, Inspector Purbright rose slowly to his feet. His movement was unhurried, almost weary, as if he were rising to comment on a point of order. He observed the scene before him, the flustered councillor, the rigid and furious victim, and the dozens of faces turning to one another, their expressions a rich tapestry of shock, concern, and in one or two notable cases, a faint but unmistakable flicker of profound satisfaction. The crime had occurred, but the performance, Purbright suspected, was only just beginning. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the theft of the Penhaligon brooch had ceased to be an incident and had become a civic legend. Like all legends, its details were fluid, adapting themselves to the teller. In the queue at Mr. Gosling's bakery, it was understood that Miss Penhaligon had let out a piercing scream and fainted dead away. At the White Hart, the publican spoke with authority of a masked intruder who had switched the boxes under the cover of a deliberate power failure. The truth, a quiet, horrified whisper in a stuffy room, was far too anemic for public consumption. Chalmsbury ran on a circulatory system of gossip, and the news of the missing brooch was a potent stimulant. It pumped through the town's arteries, from the grocer's to the post office, along the river path where the dog walkers convened, and into the hushed confines of the lending library. Each exchange added a new layer of varnish, a little embellishment of motive or opportunity, until the original event was barely visible beneath the rich patina of speculation. Sergeant Sidney Love, a man whose methodical mind preferred timetables and sworn statements to the untidy business of human nature, had been dispatched by Inspector Purbright on a specific errand. He was not to question or correct. He was merely to listen. His morning rounds, therefore, became a tour of the town's primary information exchanges. He began at the draper's, where Mrs. Loxley, Miss Penhaligon's foremost social competitor, was examining a roll of tweed with an air of profound distraction. "A terrible business. Sergeant," she said, her voice a carefully modulated performance of sympathy.
"Quite dreadful."
"For the family, you understand. The suggestion that their security could be so porous. And poor Elspeth, she is not as resilient as she once was." She paused, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "One does hear whispers about that nephew of hers, Julian, a young man with very modern ideas about money, specifically how to spend it when it belongs to other people." Sergeant Love made a small, non-committal note in his pocketbook. "Nephew J. Finch, money." His next stop was the market, where Councillor Hewing was holding forth by the fishmonger's stall, his audience a captive huddle of shoppers. "The police have the matter in hand," he announced, catching sight of the sergeant and raising his voice. "Complete confidence. A professional job, you see. They knew exactly when to strike, but they won't get far. Not in Chalmsbury." He gave Love a ponderous wink, as if they were co-conspirators in a grand strategic enterprise. The narrative was beginning to solidify. A professional job, yet also the work of the nephew. Chalmsbury's logic was flexible enough to accommodate both possibilities, suggesting a nephew of unprecedented criminal genius. By 11, Sergeant Love was in the railway station buffet, nursing a cup of tea that tasted strongly of bicarbonate of soda. Here, the talk was of timing. Mr. Sowerby, the station master, had it on good authority that Julian Finch had caught the 4:15 train to London the previous afternoon, but had been seen back in Chalmsbury looking flustered. Less than 2 hours later, Said he'd forgotten his briefcase, Mr. Sowerby confided, polishing a glass. Briefcase? Or was he establishing an alibi?
That's what I ask myself.
A man doesn't forget his briefcase if there's important business in it. Stands to reason Love dutifully recorded this. 4:15 train, returned, flustered. The case against Julian Finch was being built entirely from circumstantial adjectives. He returned to the police station shortly before noon. The building, a red brick monument to Victorian civic pride, was an island of quiet in the sea of speculation. Purbright was in his office, studying a map of the Upper Chal Valley's drainage system.
It seemed to hold his complete attention. Well, Sergeant?
Purbright asked without looking up. Love stood to attention, opened his notebook, and began his recital. The consensus, sir, appears to be firm. The guilty party is Julian Finch, the nephew of Miss Penhaligon. Consensus? Purbright murmured, his finger tracing the path of a small, meandering tributary. A comforting thing, consensus. He has debts, sir. According to Mrs. Loxley, he was seen in town yesterday afternoon, according to Mr. Sowerby at the station. He looked shifty, according to 3 separate individuals in the market, although their definitions of shifty varied. The motive is assumed to be financial, to pay gambling debts.
The method was...
Well, the method is unclear, but it is felt that being a relative would have afforded him unique opportunities. I see, said Purbright. He finally looked up from his map, his expression one of mild academic interest. So the town has conducted its own inquiry, held a trial, and reached a verdict, all before lunchtime.
A model of efficiency. Sergeant Love was unsure if this was praise.
It does seem to be the most logical line of inquiry, sir. Oh, undoubtedly, Purbright agreed, his voice placid. It is neat, it is simple, and it has a villain we are already predisposed to dislike. It is an entirely satisfactory solution. He paused, his gaze turning to the window, through which the mundane life of Chalmsbury continued, serene and undisturbed, which is precisely what makes me so uneasy. Inspector Purbright folded the drainage map with the care of a man putting a delicate instrument back in its case. The public's appetite for a simple narrative is a remarkable thing, Sergeant, he observed. But we have a professional obligation to be a little more curious.
I think it is time we visited the scene of the...
Well, not the crime, but the discovery. More importantly, the owner. The laurels stood on a slight incline overlooking the town, a position that seemed less a geographical feature than a statement of intent. It was a large, unsmiling house of red brick and granite, surrounded by a high wall topped with shards of broken glass that glinted in the afternoon sun. The laurels that gave the house its name grew in dense, dark clumps, admitting little light and offering no welcome. It was not a home. It was a garrison. Their ring at the bell was answered not by a uniformed maid, as Sergeant Love had expected, but by a woman who seemed to be composed entirely of faded browns and greys. She was thin and moved with a nervous, bird-like agitation, her hands fluttering at the collar of her cardigan. This, Purbright deduced, was Mrs. Agnes Gable, Miss Penhaligon's companion. "The police," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Miss Penhaligon is expecting you." She led them through a hall panelled in dark, funereal oak. The air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of beeswax and the faint, dusty aroma of things left undisturbed for decades. Every surface that could be polished was polished to a terrifying gleam. Every object, from a porcelain shepherdess to a brass dinner gong, stood in its designated place with military precision. It was a house that had been marshalled, not lived in. Miss Elspeth Penhaligon was waiting for them in the drawing-room, a chamber so crowded with heavy furniture and ancestral portraits that the daylight fought a losing battle against the shadows. She was seated bolt upright in a wing-backed chair, not as a victim awaiting assistance, but as a monarch granting an audience. The empty velvet box was on a small table beside her, an item of state evidence. "Inspector," she said, her tone acknowledging his rank, but not his authority. "I trust you have made progress." "We are in the early stages of our inquiries, Miss Penhaligon," Purbright said placidly, taking the chair she indicated. Sergeant Love, clutching his notebook, remained standing by the door, an attendant at a courtly proceeding. "It was a brazen act," she continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "To perpetrate such a thing in the assembly rooms in front of the town's most notable people, it is the sheer impudence that I find so
offensive. The monetary value, I understand, is considerable," Purbright prompted gently. Miss Penhaligon's nostrils flared.
"One does not discuss the monetary value of one's heritage, Inspector. Its worth is historical. The affront is to my family, to its legacy." She looked past him, her gaze falling on one of the glowering portraits. "It has been in my possession for 40 years. It never leaves my sight." Purbright absorbed this statement. It was, he felt, an excellent example of the kind of truth that had very little to do with facts. "Could you describe your movements yesterday before the lecture?" Her recitation was crisp and precise. She had lunched at home. She had attended to some correspondence. She had spent an hour in the garden before taking tea. The box, she asserted, was in her handbag throughout. "Always in your handbag?" "Always." Mrs. Gable entered at that moment, carrying a silver tray with a porcelain tea service. Her movements were silent and economical, designed to make herself as unobtrusive as possible. She placed the tray on a low table, her eyes fixed on her task. "And your nephew, Mr. Finch? I believe he visited you yesterday?" Purbright asked, his tone casual. The question caused a subtle atmospheric shift. A new tension entered the room. Miss Penhaligon's lips formed a thin, hard line. Julian paid a brief call. "Yes." "At what time?" "Around 3. He did not stay long. He had business." The word was loaded with disapproval. "Did he have occasion to be alone in the room with your handbag, Miss Penhaligon?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I may have stepped out to give instructions to Mrs. Gable. I cannot be certain. One does not monitor one's own family for criminal intent, Inspector." Purbright turned his mild gaze towards the companion, who was pouring tea with a trembling hand. "You must have been very alarmed by the events of last night, Mrs. Gable." The woman started, splashing a little tea into a saucer. Before she could answer, Miss Penhaligon spoke for her. Miss Gable was naturally distressed.
"As were we all."
"She is a loyal and sensitive creature." The description sounded more suited to a prize spaniel than a human being. Mrs. Gable's face, a mask of anxious neutrality, did not change. And the box itself. "Miss Penhaligon," Purbright said, redirecting his attention. "Was it locked?"
"The clasp is stiff."
"That has always been sufficient." "Sufficient for whom?" Purbright wondered. He stood and walked over to the small table, picking up the velvet box. He examined its plush, empty interior. "You mentioned you were in the garden in the afternoon. Pruning your roses, I imagine?" "My hydrangeas," she corrected him sharply.
"A tiresome but necessary task." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "A
heavy handbag must be a considerable inconvenience when tackling hydrangeas." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in Miss Penhaligon's eyes. A small crack in the porcelain certainty of her account.
"One manages," she said stiffly. Purbright placed the box back on the table.
He had learned very little, and a great deal. He had learned that the house ran on fear, that the nephew was despised, and that Miss Penhaligon's memory was organized not by chronology, but by what was and was not proper. As they were shown out by the silent Mrs. Gable, Purbright paused at the door. "We will, of course, do everything in our power to recover the brooch and limit any further—"
Embarrassment, he chose the last word deliberately.
It was, he knew, the only one that truly mattered. Walking down the gravel path, Sergeant Love finally spoke, his voice heavy with frustration. "She was no help at all, sir. She barely told us a thing." "On the contrary, Sergeant," Purbright said, his eyes on the imposing facade of the laurels.
"I think she told us almost everything."
"Just not about the brooch." The Chief Constable of Chalmsbury, Mr. Harcourt, was a man who believed that the primary function of a police force was to confirm what was already obvious. He subscribed to the theory that if something looked like a duck and quacked like a duck, there was little point in wasting public funds investigating the possibility that it was a cleverly disguised swan. Upon Purbright's return, he was summoned to an office that smelled of cherry tobacco and impatience. "Well, Purbright," Harcourt began, dispensing with pleasantries, "I've had Councillor Hewing on the telephone twice this morning. Miss Penhaligon's solicitor has also been in touch." The word impunity was used. Miss Penhaligon was composed, Purbright offered. Composed. Of course she was composed. She's a Penhaligon. "That doesn't mean she wants her family jewels pinched," Harcourt retorted, stabbing a pipe stem towards a note on his desk.
The talk is all about the nephew.
"Julian Finch sounds like a nasty piece of work. Lives on an allowance he considers an insult and credit he can't afford. Sergeant Love's report confirms he was there yesterday."
He has no alibi. It's an open and shut case, Purbright.
"I want him brought in." "I intend to speak with him, sir," Purbright said calmly. "Speak with him?"
Arrest him. Put him in a cell and he'll sing like a canary by tea time.
It's the type. A bit of pressure and they crumble. I would prefer to have a little more than the town's consensus before taking that step, Purbright replied, his voice maintaining its level. "Unruffled tone," Mr. Harcourt sighed, a gust of frustrated air. "Don't be clever, Purbright. Just be quick. This isn't one of your metaphysical puzzles. It's a simple case of a rogue in the family." Julian Finch was located, without much difficulty, in the billiards room above the Red Lion, a place where young men with more time than money tended to congregate. He was, as his reputation suggested, dressed in a manner that was slightly too loud for Chalmsbury, all tweed and polished brogues, but with a faint air of fraying at the cuffs. His greeting to the two police officers was a blend of feigned amusement and raw nerve. "Inspector," he said, leaning on his cue, "come for a frame? Or is this an official visit? Don't tell me Aunt Elspeth has accused me of using the wrong fork at luncheon. We'd like a word about your visit to the Laurels yesterday." "Mr. Finch," Purbright said, his gaze taking in the young man's insolent posture. Perhaps somewhere more private. The interview was conducted in the pub's snug, a small, dark-panelled room that smelled of beer and regret. Finch slumped into a chair, all his earlier bravado curdling into sullen resentment. "Look, I'll save you the trouble," he began, before Purbright could speak.
"I went to see the old dragon to ask for a loan. An advance on my inheritance, if you like."
She refused, as she always does.
"We had words, I left."
End of story. "And you then proceeded to the railway station?" Purbright inquired. Finch's eyes darted away. "I had an appointment in London. Business? But you didn't go to London," Sergeant Love interjected, reading from his notebook. "You returned to Chalmsbury less than 2 hours later, claiming to have forgotten your briefcase." "The meeting was cancelled." Finch snapped, his voice rising. "My client telephoned me on my way to the station. Is that a crime now? Changing one's plans?" "What was in the briefcase, Mr. Finch?" Purbright asked softly. "Papers!" "What do you think?" "Business papers. My accounts." He was blustering now, his hands gesturing wildly. He was a man drowning in a story of his own making. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. "Your aunt's brooch was reported stolen last night," Purbright stated, watching him carefully.
"A valuable item.
The sort of thing that could solve a young man's financial difficulties." The effect was instantaneous. Finch shot upright in his chair, his face flushing with genuine sputtering rage.
"You think I stole it? You think I'm a common thief? That crusty old relic means nothing to me."
"I wouldn't give you tuppence for it." "It is worth a great deal more than tuppence," Love pointed out, ever the literalist. "It's the principle," Finch shouted, now thoroughly agitated.
"I might be in debt. I might not live up to my aunt's fossilized standards, but I am not a sneak thief."
"I wouldn't creep about her house stealing her blasted trinkets."
"If I wanted her money, I'd ask for it to her face. I did ask for it."
He subsided, breathing heavily, his defense resting on the curious logic that his honesty in one area precluded dishonesty in another. Purbright let the silence hang in the air. He saw a young man who was arrogant, foolish, and almost certainly a terrible liar, but he also saw something else. Finch's denials were loud, theatrical, and self-pitying. The crime, however, had been quiet, precise, and aimed at public humiliation. It had required patience and a subtle understanding of the victim. Julian Finch, Purbright suspected, possessed neither. He was a creature of impulse and noise. This was a crime of quiet poison. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Finch," Purbright said, rising to his feet. "I'd advise you not to leave Chalmsbury for the time being," Finch stared, nonplussed.
"That's it? You're not arresting me?"
"Not at present," Purbright said. As they walked back into the daylight, Sergeant Love could not contain his bafflement. So with respect, his story was a complete fabrication. "He's guilty as sin." "He's guilty of many things, Sergeant," Purbright mused. "Insolence, poor financial planning, and a rather adolescent temper. But a man who makes so much noise when he lies is rarely capable of a truly silent crime." Chief Constable Harcourt's dissatisfaction, much like the weather in Chalmsbury, was a condition to be endured rather than resolved. Purbright, having failed to provide the prompt arrest the situation seemed to demand, spent the remainder of the afternoon engaged in a flurry of paperwork, an activity he found both soothing and strategically useful. It gave the impression of diligent progress while allowing the muddy waters of public opinion time to settle. The following morning, he announced his intention to revisit the assembly rooms. Sergeant Love, who had been hoping for a more vigorous line of inquiry, perhaps involving a search of Julian Finch's living quarters for pawn tickets or expensive new cravats, looked crestfallen. "Sir, the scene has already been examined." "We examined it as the scene of a theft," Purbright corrected him gently. "I should like to look at it again, merely as a room." The lesser hall, stripped of its evening occupants, looked larger and considerably sadder. Thin morning light slanted through the tall, grimy windows, illuminating a landscape of stacked chairs and dust motes. The only sign of life was a stooped figure in brown overalls working a large, noisy electric polisher back and forth across the parquet floor. The machine's hum was accompanied by the sharp, almost ecclesiastical scent of beeswax. The caretaker, a man by the name of Fig, whose movements were as slow and predictable as a glacier, switched off his machine as they approached. "Inspector," he acknowledged with a dip of his head. He was a man of few words, having long ago learned that in a place like the assembly rooms, listening was a far more valuable skill than talking. "We won't disturb you for long, Mr. Fig," Purbright said. "I would just like to see the display table from last night." He retrieved the velvet box from the evidence bag he was carrying and placed it on the small, baize-covered table, recreating a fragment of the previous evening's tableau. Sergeant Love watched, his expression a mixture of patience and bafflement. This was not the sort of police work he understood. There was no measuring, no dusting for prints. The inspector simply stood, looking at the box as if expecting it to speak. Purbright picked it up. The velvet was worn smooth in patches, a testament to its age. He opened the lid and stared at the empty silk lining. He was not, however, looking. He was, in his own quiet way, listening to the object. He raised it slightly, almost to his face, a gesture of close examination, and there it was. It was not a clue in the traditional sense. It was nothing that could be photographed or submitted as evidence. It was a smell, faint, certainly, and heavily overlaid with the scent of old fabric and the indefinable dust of ages. But it was unmistakably there, clinging to the fibres of the velvet, the sharp, clean, waxy perfume of Mr. Fig's floor polish. Purbright lowered the box, his face betraying nothing of the small, significant click of a piece falling into place inside his mind. He turned his attention to the caretaker. "You maintain an excellent shine on these floors, Mr. Fig." "It's the beeswax," Fig said with a flicker of professional pride. "Gives a proper finish. None of that new varnish stuff, I'm sure. You must have polished in here yesterday in preparation for the society's meeting." Every Tuesday morning, Fig confirmed. Like clockwork. Then I set out the chairs in the afternoon. So you were here for most of the day? On and off.
Had to pop out for a bit. But I was here when Councillor Hewing came in to check the arrangements.
Around 4, that would have been. He was fussing about the position of the lectern as usual. Purbright let the details settle.
Did anyone else come in to help with the arrangements?
Fig scratched his jaw. Not to help, no. Just the councillor and...
Oh, one of the ladies from the society dropped something off.
Put it on that very table. Said it was for the display. Sergeant Love's pen, which had been dormant, suddenly sprang to life.
One of the ladies? Who, Mr. Fig?
The caretaker shrugged his bony shoulders.
I wouldn't know her name.
A little bird of a woman, grey coat, seemed in a bit of a tizzy, didn't stay but a moment. Purbright looked at the velvet box in his hand. He thought of Miss Penhaligon's iron-clad assertion that it had never left her handbag. He thought of her gardening gloves, her battle with the hydrangeas, and the inconvenience of a heavy bag. He balanced the faint, incongruous scent of beeswax against the furious, blustering denials of Julian Finch, the scales of the case, which had been so heavily weighted in one direction, began to move as they left the hall, stepping out into the fresh air. Love was buzzing with the new information.
A woman, sir.
It changes everything. We need to get a description from him. Perhaps, Purbright said, his tone thoughtful. But what I find more interesting than who she was is what she was doing, delivering the main attraction hours ahead of the star performer.
A curious little breach of protocol, wouldn't you say?
A breach of protocol, Purbright reflected, was often more revealing than a breach of the law. The law was a blunt instrument concerned with large, obvious transgressions. Protocol, however, governed the delicate, intricate machinery of social life. To disrupt it was to declare a very specific and personal kind of war. Leaving the assembly rooms, he instructed Sergeant Love to make a list of the female members of the Antiquarian Society's organizing committee. Love, scenting a proper line of investigation at last, set off with a renewed sense of purpose. Purbright, meanwhile, took a leisurely stroll towards the High Street. His own methods were less direct. He did not believe in hunting his quarry. He preferred to wait at the waterhole, knowing that habit and routine would eventually bring them to him. He found Mrs. Beatrice Locksley, as he had suspected he might in Chapman's Delicatessen, a shop whose high prices served as an effective filter against the general populace. She was contemplating a display of olives with the critical intensity of a bomb disposal expert. "Inspector Purbright," she said, turning as he approached. Her surprise was well managed, but not entirely convincing.
Any news for our poor Elspeth, I hope?
"Inquiries are proceeding, Mrs. Locksley," Purbright said, his tone conveying neither optimism nor despair. "A most unfortunate affair. The brooch is, I'm told, the centrepiece of her family's history. Mrs. Locksley selected a jar of capers. Oh, undoubtedly. The Penhaligons have always been most
enthusiastic about their history." A faint, sharp edge entered her voice.
"Though between ourselves, Inspector, historical accuracy is not always their strongest suit. That story about the Stuart King, for instance. Pure theatre."
Any serious antiquarian knows it's a fabrication. Indeed?
Purbright asked, his interest mild. "Oh, completely." She warmed to her theme, her earlier sympathy for poor Elspeth evaporating. "The brooch is almost certainly late Georgian, a rather florid example at that. The Penhaligons acquired it in the 19th century from a bankrupt landowner, but they invented the royal connection to eclipse the Locksley Charter." "The Locksley Charter?" Purbright inquired, feigning ignorance. Mrs. Locksley's eyes lit with the fire of deeply held grievance. "My family's ancestor, Sir Thomas Locksley, was granted the charter for Chalmsbury's market by Edward IV. It is the founding document of this town."
A genuine piece of history.
"But it is, alas, only a piece of parchment. It is difficult for parchment to compete with a shiny, romantic bauble and a completely fictitious king. Here, then, was a motive that had nothing to do with money. It was a motive of pure, concentrated envy, distilled over generations. The brooch was not a treasure to be stolen, but a lie to be exposed, a symbol of a rival's undeserved supremacy. Purbright left Mrs. Locksley to her olives, his mind turning to the other woman whose life was so intimately bound up with the Penhaligon legacy. Mr. Figg's description of a little bird of a woman could, with a little imagination, be made to fit Mrs. Locksley, but it fit Mrs. Agnes Gable, the companion, perfectly. He did not return to the laurels. An interview under Miss Penhaligon's roof would yield nothing but frightened loyalty. Instead, he sent a polite message via a constable requesting that Mrs. Gable meet him on a matter of some urgency. He suggested the small public garden behind the library, a neutral space of municipal roses and cast-iron benches. She arrived looking flustered and apologetic, as if her very existence were an inconvenience.
"Inspector,
"Is there news?" "Miss Penhaligon is resting. She doesn't know I am here." "I have just a few questions, Mrs. Gable, which I felt would be better asked in private," Purbright said kindly.
Gesturing to a bench, he did not begin with the brooch.
He asked about her, about how long she had been with Miss Penhaligon, about her life before Chalmsbury. At first, her answers were clipped and guarded, full of praise for her employer's generosity. But Purbright's patient, unjudging manner was a language she was not used to, and slowly the bleak reality of her position emerged between the lines of her dutiful replies. It was a life lived on command. Her days were a litany of small, thankless tasks, fetching spectacles that were inches away, rereading letters aloud because Miss Penhaligon's concentration had wavered, bearing the blame for draughts from windows or tea that was fractionally too cool. She was a shadow, a function, a pair of hands. "Miss Penhaligon places a great deal of trust in you," Purbright observed. "She must allow you to handle her most precious things." A flicker of something. Resentment?
"Irony," crossed Mrs. Gable's face before being swiftly suppressed. "Oh no, not the brooch. I was never permitted to touch the brooch."
Or the box. It was always kept in her bedroom. She would bring it down herself. And on the day of the lecture, Mrs. Gable hesitated. She was in a dreadful state all afternoon. Her nephew had called. They had a terrible argument about money.
After he left, she was agitated.
She said the town was full of grasping, ungrateful people, and that she was a fool to share her heritage with them. "An upsetting experience for you both," Purbright sympathized. "She had one of her headaches," Mrs. Gable continued, the words tumbling out now, a quiet torrent of stored-up frustration. She said the thought of the lecture, of having to sit there and make small talk, was unbearable. She said she had half a mind not to go. Purbright remained silent, letting her speak. The motive here was not the grand envy of the Locksleys, but something smaller, more intimate, and perhaps more potent. It was the cumulative weight of 1,000 daily slights, the slow, grinding erosion of a human soul. He now had two suspects, one who wished to tear down a public symbol of a rival's prestige, and another who might simply wish for one blessed evening to inconvenience a tyrant. The investigation, having briefly threatened to expand, now seemed to contract back into a state of thoughtful inertia. Inspector Purbright spent the next morning in his office, not, as Sergeant Love noted with some impatience, compiling evidence or dispatching constables, but reading a slim volume on English church architecture. Love was of the opinion that the case required legwork. The inspector seemed to feel it required a comfortable chair. He had two plausible motives from two plausible suspects, but both were constructed from the flimsy material of emotion, envy and resentment. There was still no solid object to connect anyone to the crime. It was the telephone that provided it. The caller was the Reverend Pringle, the vicar of St. Jude's, and his voice was a flustered staccato of apology and alarm. He requested the inspector's presence on a matter of some delicacy, a matter which, he felt, might have some bearing on the unfortunate Penhaligon business. St. Jude's was a cold, cavernous building that smelled of damp stone and faith. They found the vicar, and his verger, a man named Dawlish, with a face like a worried walnut, huddled near the front pews as if for warmth. Between them, resting on the polished oak of the pulpit steps, was a small, dark velvet box. "It's the verger's cleaning day," the Reverend Pringle explained, wringing his hands. He was dusting the Penhaligon pew. It is always the first one he attends to.
A matter of tradition, and he noticed one of the floorboards was not quite flush. Mr. Dawlish, seeing his moment, stepped forward. "Felt it under my knee, I did. A looseness."
Been meaning to see to it for months. "So I got my pry bar just to have a look at the joists, you see.
"And I found this."
Tucked down in the cavity." Purbright bent down to examine the discovery. It was, to all appearances, the twin of the box he had inspected at the assembly rooms. It had the same domed lid, the same patina of age on the velvet, the same small brass clasp. He flicked it open. The silk lining, like its counterpart, was empty. Sergeant Love drew a sharp breath. "It's a duplicate, sir. The thief must have made a switch." He looked triumphant. This was the sort of clue he understood, a tangible object, a piece of criminal apparatus. He must have swapped them before the lecture even began.
"It proves premeditation." Purbright said nothing.
He picked up the box, turning it over in his hands. It was a good copy, but it was a copy. The velvet was a fraction less worn, the lining a shade brighter. A prop, not an heirloom. He walked with it to the Penhaligon pew, a grand affair of dark carved wood, and looked down at the exposed cavity in the floorboards. "Why here?" he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "It's a hiding place, sir," Love offered. "He dumps the evidence after the fact. But why not a river, Sergeant? Or a rubbish bin? Why go to the trouble of concealing an empty box in a church? And not just any church, but in the very pew where the Penhaligon family has sat in judgment upon their neighbours for the past 200 years. The Reverend Pringle coughed nervously. "It is a rather pointed location, I must admit." "It is more than pointed, Vicar," Purbright said, his voice quiet.
"It is theatrical. A thief who wants money simply takes the jewel."
He does not commission a replica of its box, arrange for the original to be left in a public hall, and then hide the replica in a place freighted with family symbolism.
This is not a concealment.
It is a second performance. He saw the case with a new clarity now. The empty box at the lecture had been the public act of humiliation. This second box was a private, taunting footnote, a piece of stagecraft for the police, and perhaps for Miss Penhaligon herself, to discover. It was a gesture of profound and calculated contempt. The neat, if unproven, case against Julian Finch now lay in ruins. His was a motive of grubby, straightforward greed. This act spoke of a far more patient and imaginative malice. It was the work of someone who understood not the monetary value of the brooch, but its immense symbolic weight. Someone who wanted not to be richer, but to prove a point. "Our culprit, Sergeant," Purbright said as they left the cold silence of the church. "The duplicate box, now safely in an evidence bag, is not a common thief. They are a dramatist. They are writing a play in 3 acts. The theft was the first. This discovery is the second. And the third act, sir?"
Love asked, thoroughly bewildered. "Ah," said Purbright, a faint, thoughtful smile touching his lips.
"The third act is the denouement, and I suspect the author is waiting for us to provide the stage." Back in the quiet of his office, Inspector Purbright placed the 2 velvet boxes side by side on his desk. They sat there like a pair of dark, silent witnesses. One was the genuine article, freighted with the history of a family. The other was a fiction, a piece of well-made artifice. The case, he reflected, was contained entirely within the difference between them. One represented a crime of property, the other a crime of psychology. And Purbright had no doubt which was the more significant. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, was attempting to impose order on the chaos by compiling a timeline. It was an admirable but Purbright suspected a futile endeavour. The truth of this matter would not be found in a sequence of events, but in the knotted tangle of human feelings that had precipitated them. Purbright leaned back in his chair, the scent of old paper and stale ink a familiar comfort. He thought about Chalmsbury. He had been stationed here long enough to understand that the town operated on a set of unwritten but rigidly enforced laws. These laws had little to do with the statutes of the realm and everything to do with precedence, reputation, and the meticulous accounting of ancient slights. In Chalmsbury, a person's standing was not determined by their wealth, which could be vulgar, but by the age of their grievances and the quality of their heirlooms. The Penhaligon brooch was the town's gold standard of ancestral prestige. To steal it for money would have been a crude, unimaginative act. Julian Finch was capable of such an act, but this crime was anything but crude. It was subtle, elegant, and deeply personal. It was a crime conceived and executed according to the peculiar social grammar of the town. The faint scent of beeswax polish on the original box had been the first indication of this. It was a detail that spoke of a different timeline, an alternative narrative to the one Miss Penhaligon had constructed around herself. It suggested the box had been out of her possession and resting on a municipally polished surface for some time before the lecture. It suggested an accomplice, or at least an unwitting agent, in the form of a nervous woman in a grey coat. Then came the duplicate box. This was the masterstroke, the gesture that elevated the affair from a simple theft to a piece of satirical art. It was a message intended for an audience of one, the inspector himself. It said, "You are looking for the wrong thing. This is not about what was taken. It is about the act of taking itself. Hiding it in the family pew was an act of exquisite, calculated insolence." He considered his two playwrights, Mrs. Locksley, burning with a dynastic envy that had been simmering for generations. For her, the brooch was a fraudulent symbol, and its public disappearance a way of humiliating her rival and reasserting the primacy of the Locksley Charter. It was a grand historical motive, played out on a public stage. Then there was Mrs. Gable, the companion, a woman rendered practically invisible by years of quiet servitude. Her motive would be smaller, a desperate, accumulated need to disrupt the suffocating order of her employer's life, to cause a single, catastrophic crack in the polished surface of Miss Penhaligon's composure. The crime, Purbright mused, had elements that suited both of them. The public spectacle fitted Mrs. Locksley's grievance. The quiet, behind-the-scenes manipulation, arranging for the box to be delivered early, had the feel of Mrs. Gable's unobtrusive world. He looked at the two boxes again. The crime was a performance. The culprit, therefore, was a performer, and a performer, even a secret one, craves an audience and a final bow. The case could not be solved by collecting statements and examining clues in the traditional way. It had to be concluded in the same manner in which it had been conducted, as a social ceremony. A slow, deliberate plan began to form in his mind. He would not find the truth in this office, or by interviewing witnesses again. The truth lay dormant in the drawing-room at the Laurels, the stage upon which all these miniature dramas had their origins. He would have to provide the setting for the third act himself. He picked up his pen. "Sergeant," he said, pulling a fresh sheet of paper towards him, "I believe the time has come for a cup of tea." Love looked up from his timeline, confused. "Sir? In Chalmsbury?" Purbright continued, his pen scratching quietly. "More truth is revealed over a tea table than in any dozen interrogation rooms. We are going to arrange a small gathering." The invitations, if they could be called such, were issued by telephone. Inspector Purbright's tone was one of polite deference, framing the proposed meeting not as an interrogation, but as a matter of courtesy. To Miss Penhaligon, he presented it as a personal update, a way of keeping her informed in the privacy of her own home. He then suggested, with careful casualness, that as a leading figure in the antiquarian society, Mrs. Locksley's presence might also be valuable. It was a piece of social bait that Miss Penhaligon, ever conscious of her duties and unwilling to allow Mrs. Locksley to seem more central to the affair than herself, could not refuse, and so at 4 o'clock the next day, the three women were assembled in the oppressive grandeur of the drawing-room at the Laurels. A state of polite, undeclared warfare prevailed. Miss Penhaligon occupied her wing-backed chair like a citadel under siege. Mrs. Locksley, perched on the edge of a hard-backed sofa, radiated an aura of brisk, critical sympathy. Between them, moving with the silent, self-effacing tread of a ghost, Mrs. Gable dispensed the rituals of afternoon tea. The air was thick with unspoken resentments. The conversation, steered carefully by Purbright, navigated the treacherous shallows of local affairs, the lamentable state of the petunias in the public gardens, the vicar's uninspired choice of hymns for the harvest festival. Sergeant Love sat in a corner, his pen poised over his notebook, an official recorder at a peace conference where both sides were merely reloading their weapons. Purbright allowed the ceremony to unfold. He ate a cucumber sandwich with quiet appreciation. He accepted a second cup of tea. He understood that the rigid structure of the occasion was a form of armor for its participants. Only when the plates had been cleared and a fragile quiet had settled did he finally address the reason for their gathering. "I am grateful to you both for agreeing to this meeting," he began, addressing the two seated women but acutely aware of the third, who was now standing by the mantelpiece, ostensibly to straighten a photograph.
"Our investigation has been complex.
We have had to discard several early theories." He glanced meaningfully at Miss Penhaligon, a silent acknowledgement of the now sidelined matter of her nephew. "And?" Miss Penhaligon prompted, her voice sharp with impatience. "And we are now pursuing a new, more promising line of inquiry," Purbright continued smoothly. He paused, letting the weight of his unspoken information settle in the room. "We have a witness." A flicker of interest from Mrs. Locksley, a stiffening in Miss Penhaligon's posture. "A gentleman of hobbies," Purbright went on, his tone dryly anecdotal. "An ornithologist. He was observing warblers down by the old footbridge that crosses the Chal on the afternoon of the lecture. It is a secluded spot. He was surprised to see a lady there. He let the word lady hang in the air. She appeared, in his words, to be in a state of some agitation. What particularly drew his attention was that she was carrying a small, dark object.
A box of some sort.
He had the distinct impression she was about to throw it into the river, but she saw him and hurried away. Purbright fell silent. His gaze was neutral, his expression one of mild inquiry, but behind it, his attention was stretched taut, monitoring the subtle atmospheric pressures in the room. Miss Penhaligon was the first to speak, her voice a clarion call of disbelief. "The river?
What utter nonsense!
Who would do such a thing?" The man was clearly mistaken. "His eyesight is, by necessity of his hobby, extremely keen," Purbright said placidly. Mrs. Locksley gave a short, condescending laugh. "Really, Inspector? A bird watcher? They are notoriously unreliable. He probably saw a kingfisher with a vole. One cannot take such a person seriously." Her dismissal was swift, decisive, and perhaps a fraction too forceful. Her hands, Purbright noted, were clasped very tightly around her handbag. He did not look at Mrs. Gable. He did not need to. From the corner of his eye he had registered the sound he had been listening for. It was not a gasp or a word. It was the barely audible, high-pitched clink of porcelain against porcelain as the teacup she was holding trembled in its saucer. It was the smallest of sounds, a tiny signal of distress, lost in the grander drama being played out by her social superiors, but to Purbright it was as loud and as clear as a gunshot. He had his answer. The bird-watcher by the river was a fiction, a lure cast into the placid surface of the drawing-room.
And someone had twitched the line. "Well, it is a line of inquiry we must pursue, however fanciful it may seem," he concluded, rising to his feet.
"Thank you for the tea, Miss Penhaligon. You have been most helpful." The meeting was over. The combatants parted with stiff, formal pleasantries. As they walked away from the house, Sergeant Love shook his head. "I'm not sure that told us very much, sir." They both seemed to think it was nonsense. "Yes," Purbright agreed, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. But one of them thought it was nonsense. The other was terrified it might be true. Yeah, Inspector Purbright did not leave. He paused with his hand on the ornate brass doorknob, turning back to face the room. The air, which had begun to decompress with the end of the meeting, grew instantly taut again. "Before I go," he said, his voice retaining its placid, conversational tone, "I feel I should perhaps clarify the matter of the witness. You see, there is no bird watcher. There is no man by the river."
I invented him. The statement dropped into the room with the force of a physical object.
Miss Penhaligon stared, aghast at this breach of official conduct. Mrs. Locksley's face became a stony mask.
Her eyes narrowing. Mrs. Gable,
who had been collecting the last of the teacups, froze in place. Her back to the room. "You see," Purbright continued, leaving the door and walking slowly back to the centre of the room, "I have been proceeding on a false assumption. I was looking for a single culprit, for a single unified motive. But this was never a single crime. It was two," he began by addressing Miss Penhaligon. "A theory surrounding your nephew was, as I suspected, incorrect. This was not a crime of crude financial gain. It was a crime of emotion,
of symbolism." He then turned his mild gaze upon Mrs. Locksley, and for a time I was convinced it was a crime born of historical rivalry.
The duplicate box found in your rival's family pew was a magnificent piece of theatre. It spoke of a grand gesture, of a feud between dynasties.
"It was almost too perfect." Mrs. Locksley gave a tight, dismissive smile.
"As I said, Inspector, fanciful." "Precisely," Purbright agreed. "It was a fiction, a clever, malicious story superimposed upon a much simpler, sadder one. The real crime, the original crime, had nothing to do with Stuart kings or market charters.
It had its origins right here in this room.
It was a crime born of exhaustion." He let his gaze finally rest on the still, silent figure of Mrs. Gable. "It began on the afternoon of the lecture, did it not, Mrs. Gable? Your employer was in a state of agitation after an argument with her nephew. She spoke of not attending the lecture at all. For you who had borne the weight of her humours for so many years, it was perhaps the final straw. You saw a chance not to steal, but to disrupt, to create a moment of chaos in a life of suffocating order." Mrs. Gable's shoulders began to tremble, but she did not turn around. "The plan was simple," Purbright went on, his voice gentle. "While Miss Penhaligon was distracted, you removed the brooch from its box. You hid it somewhere safe inside this house. Then you took the empty box and arranged for it to be delivered to the assembly rooms, knowing it would not be opened until the grand moment. You knew that Mr. Figg, the caretaker, would see you, but you also knew he would see only a little bird of a woman performing an errand. You counted on your own invisibility. The scent of beeswax polish on the box told me it had been sitting in the hall for some time." He paused. "Your only intention was to cause a brief, sharp embarrassment."
"I imagine you planned to find the brooch a day or two later, perhaps fallen behind a cushion, and be rewarded for your diligence."
A small secret victory. But you had not counted on the imagination of others. Now he turned back to Mrs. Locksley, whose composure was beginning to fray. "You have nursed a grievance against the Penhaligon family for years, Mrs. Locksley. You heard the news of the theft, and you saw a golden opportunity not just to witness a humiliation, but to amplify it, to turn a domestic incident into a town-wide scandal with yourself as the knowing chorus. You already had the means, the duplicate box, a prop, I suspect, made for you some time ago by a theatrical costumier waiting for the right moment to be deployed. This is an outrageous accusation." Mrs. Locksley snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "Is it?" Purbright asked softly. "You planted it in the church in the Penhaligon pew."
A masterstroke of psychological warfare.
You created a mystery that pointed away from the simple truth and towards a far grander narrative, one that cemented the Penhaligons as frauds and yourself as the guardian of the town's real history. But you made one small error. When I mentioned my fictitious witness by the river, you were not merely dismissive.
You were scornful.
And you were scornful because you knew with absolute certainty that no box had ever been taken to the river to be disposed of. The only box you were concerned with was the one you yourself had placed in the church. He then looked at Mrs. Gable's trembling back. Mrs. Gable, on the other hand, reacted quite differently.
She was terrified. Why?
Because after taking the brooch, she had in fact taken the original empty box out of the house in a panic. She hid it, not by the river, but in a dusty, disused linen press in the vestibule of the assembly rooms, a place she knew from helping to set up previous society events. My story of a witness felt horribly plausibly close to the truth of her own actions. It was her quiet panic, the rattle of a teacup, that confirmed the simple, domestic heart of the crime. A small, choked sob finally came from Mrs. Gable. She turned, her face streaked with tears, a portrait of utter defeat. Miss Penhaligon stared, speechless, first at her companion, then at her rival. The twin betrayals, one born of quiet desperation and the other of venomous pride, had left her utterly adrift. Purbright's voice was devoid of triumph. It was simply the voice of a man stating a conclusion. The whole affair has been a sad comedy of manners, driven by two very different kinds of human pride. And now I believe it is over. He looked at the weeping companion. Mrs. Gable, he said, his tone softening to one of almost paternal kindness. Will you show me where you hid the brooch? There was no grand confession. There was only the quiet, shuffling walk of a defeated woman. Mrs. Gable led them from the drawing-room, not to a secret safe or a hidden floorboard, but to a small pantry at the back of the house. From a shelf, behind a row of tins containing lentils and dried barley, she took down a plain biscuit tin decorated with a faded portrait of the late King George VIII. She opened it. There, nestled amongst a tangle of spare buttons and old sewing machine needles, lay the Penhaligon brooch. Its gold and gemstones looked absurdly, garishly out of place. Miss Penhaligon let out a small, wounded sound. She did not look at the brooch, but at the face of the woman who had served her for 15 years. Mrs. Locksley, for her part, remained silent, her face a mask of cold fury. She had been outmaneuvered not by a rival, but by a policeman who understood the value of good manners. The aftermath was handled with the careful discretion that Chalmsbury reserved for the indiscretions of its more important citizens. A full prosecution, as Purbright explained later, to a grudgingly accepting chief constable would serve no public good. It would create a scandal that would tarnish the town's reputation and provide endless, unedifying gossip. It was better, he argued, for the matter to be resolved domestically. And so it was. Mrs. Gable was dismissed that same evening, vanishing from the laurels with a single suitcase. Her destination unknown and to Chalmsbury of no interest, Mrs. Locksley returned to her own home, secure in the knowledge that no official charge would be brought, but burdened by the more terrible knowledge that Elspeth Penhaligon now possessed a weapon against which there was no defence. The truth. The long, cold war between the two houses would continue, but its terms of engagement had been irrevocably altered. The official police report, typed by Purbright himself, was a masterpiece of benign fiction. It stated that the heirloom had been, unfortunately, mislaid by Miss Penhaligon's companion in a state of confusion and had now been recovered. The appearance of a hoax object in the church was attributed to a malicious but unrelated prankster, and the file was duly closed. Chalmsbury, having been deprived of a satisfyingly dramatic conclusion, contented itself with the knowledge that the nephew, Julian Finch, had been exonerated and soon found other more pressing matters to discuss, such as the substandard quality of the prize-winning marrow at the village fete. A few days later, Purbright was in his office, the window open to the familiar sounds of the market. The case, which had briefly consumed the town's emotional energy, had receded, leaving behind barely a ripple. Sergeant Love entered with 2 cups of strong, milky tea and placed one on the inspector's desk. "All tidied up then, sir," he said, gesturing towards the filing cabinet where the Penhaligon file now rested. "So it would seem." "Sergeant," Purbright replied, watching a flock of pigeons scatter from the roof of the town hall. Love hesitated, a question troubling his orderly mind. "That business with the 2 boxes, sir? Mrs. Locksley's part in it? It seems wrong somehow that she gets away with it." Purbright took a thoughtful sip of his tea. "Gets away with it?" he mused.
"I doubt Mrs. Locksley sees it that way."
"She will have to attend the same committees as Miss Penhaligon. She will have to exchange polite greetings in the high street and send a Christmas card every year. For the rest of her life, she will have to live under the calm, knowing gaze of a woman whose deepest vulnerabilities she has seen and who has seen hers in return. In Chelmsbury, Sergeant, that is a far more severe sentence than any magistrate could impose." He picked up a new file from his desk, a tedious but blessedly simple case of a stolen bicycle. The town's intricate social machinery, having been momentarily disrupted, had reset itself. Business as ever was proceeding as usual. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.